Welcome back to another edition of Force Friday, where we talk about Star Wars theories, characters, concepts, comparisons, analyzations, collectibles, and more.
And today we're going to be talking about the transition from clone to Stormtrooper. It's one of the things people have asked that we take a look at, and it's also some interesting history that none of us really talk about a whole lot. We just sort of assume we know, and for the most part we're kind of right, but it's worth going through it. So we know that the clone troopers made up the main forces of the Grand Army of the Republic and were created with the DNA of Jango Fett. We also know that they aged at double time, so in a 10-year stretch, you have a 20-year-old adult ready for combat. And this is what we see at the start of the war in Attack of the Clones. With Order 66 given by Darth Sidious, the Jedi were eradicated in the First Galactic Empire was formed before the Senate. The Emperor's policy of military expansion saw the continued growth of the army to combat the remaining separatist worlds and anyone else who opposed the New Order. Imperial Army troopers were the main infantry force used by the Empire as it tightened its grip on the galaxy. This group was generally made up of local defense groups who were volunteers during the Clone Wars and then conscripted into the Imperial Army post-war. So this is something that's happening in concert with the transition of clone to Stormtrooper. It's good to get that noted and out there before we get started, because we're here to talk about the clone troopers themselves, but I just wanted to show these guys and talk about them because it was supplementary infantry being used by the Empire at the time of kind of transitioning between the two eras. It also explains the difference between the sort of infantry that you see on Mimban and Solo versus kind of our typical what we expect Stormtrooper, and the difference between the two. So let's get back to the transition. So the clone troopers had to be reorganized into Stormtrooper legions, also known as Stormtrooper Corps. Founded by clone commandos, the Corps were initially elite shock troopers with the best possible training on Kamino, battle-hardened from the Clone Wars and ready to defend the Empire at all costs. Shortly after the formation of the Empire, clone production on Kamino had come to an end, and the last generation of clones joined the Stormtrooper Corps. This suspension was put into effect based on the dramatic drop in post-war casualties, as well as the overall expense, because the death tolls were no longer catastrophic. This change didn't cause a disruption in military manpower. Neither did it cause a disruption to communications, which could only mean one thing: invasion. The army is expanding. However, it doesn't have to take in the amount of infantry it used to have to take in because they're not losing soldiers by the hundreds like they were during the Clone Wars. So the clone numbers were strong. But after a few years, the accelerated aging process remained a problem and became a more glaring one. All the older units started to see their physical skills and abilities begin to deteriorate. This is another aspect that the Republic and then the Empire didn't have to worry about too much because, once again, they were losing clones at an exponential rate. Now, with more peaceful quote-unquote times, you're seeing more aging in the effects and deterioration of the aging on the infantry. So a new generation of recruits became a necessity. It was time to induct non-clones into the Corps. During the Clone Wars, the Grand Army of the Republic was built off of the clone template and had little room for volunteers. But during this time, faithful citizens of the Republic wished and dreamed to do their part. Now, under the Empire's new order, they finally had their chance. Ordinary citizens could now enlist for military service in the hopes of wearing the armor of the Imperial Stormtrooper and becoming heroes like the clones they idolized. And with Imperial nationalism at a height, there was a great number of people signing up for the Corps. By this time, veteran clones still in service remained in commanding positions, with the older generations becoming trainers and instructors at Imperial academies. Clone troopers were bred into a world of non-stop military training, simulations, and testing, both mental and physical. They also enjoyed sports and learned brotherhood through teamwork. The new Imperial cadets had an accelerated and rigorous training regime and were subjected to aggressive programs of indoctrination to produce troopers fiercely loyal to the Empire. However, I hear that target practice was not one of the top priorities. But it was around this time that the Imperial Army troopers began to be replaced almost entirely by stormtroopers as the main ground force, with Army troopers seeing limited use for the remainder of the Empire's days. There was a heavy contrast from the clones to the non-clone trooper. Although these ranks possessed some of the finest weaponry and armor, they were generally less respected as soldiers in comparison to their clone predecessors, especially by enemies of the Empire. It's believed that the training wasn't nearly as efficient as it needed to be and is to blame for the stormtroopers' decrease in operational effectiveness. This is, after all, a military organization that's been set up to, and for the most part by, clones to train clones who already have the DNA to be effective soldiers. Now they're transitioning to a new type of trooper with perhaps less talent but longer lifespan and arguably cheaper to maintain, saying that, I don't really know what the Caminos charged them, but with those skinny little bodies, I'm sure they don't have much of an appetite. But noting the difference both culturally and professionally, it's not hard to imagine the growing pains between the two. You have strict military regimenting with the clones. The clones are needed for immediate combat. They're thrown into a war that lasts years and years and years with tons of casualties, tons of victories, but both of these ultimately lead to experience for the rest of the clone army. So by the end of the prequel era, you have a super seasoned, naturally gifted soldier on the front lines. As we start to transition from that period between the prequels and the original trilogy, you're substituting that for something that's going to provide a longer tenure of service at arguably and most possibly a lower skill level for a cheaper rate, which will not have the same experience as the clones before it, as it's basically enlisting in peaceful times to maintain an army that's pretty much crushed out all competition and opposition. So the caliber of trooper that you need really isn't on the same level as what you needed a few years prior. By 4 years before the Battle of Yavin, most clones had been decommissioned and were regarded as obsolete. Those that survived to see a retirement from the Corps became security consultants, strategists, and in some cases, the prestigious position of the Emperor's Royal Guard. Yet some clones remained in service right up until the Battle of Yavin. But with the destruction of the Death Star, they became a lost breed. After this, they became a very rare sight, and perhaps even the stuff of legend, and it probably felt like you were bumping into a celebrity to actually bump into one. So, long story long, that's how you go from a bounty hunter for hire to getting his DNA to producing clones that become an army for the Republic that later are used as a tool for the Empire, are eventually supplemented with local volunteers to diversify an army across the vast reaches of space, to only become uniformed with a minimal amount of training and information passed down from the glory days of the Grand Army to what became the foot soldiers of the Galactic Empire during the original trilogy era. And now to close this out, we'll throw a few extra fun facts and theories into it. There may have been certain physical characteristics of the Stormtrooper that you had to meet in order to become enlisted. Perhaps you didn't have to sign up for target practice, but instead you had to be at least 6 foot tall. This could explain how Luke would be too short to be a Stormtrooper. Now you could say that all the clones were 6 feet and that's where that line comes from, but we know that very few were in service at that time. A clone trooper would have readily identified the short Luke Skywalker in disguise and caused alert to their presence. There is the suggestion of trooper legacy. It's believed that mutant clones, such as those found in Clone Wars 99, the Bad Batch, also made up groups such as Task Force 99, also known as SCAR, Special Commando Advanced Recon Squadron. But perhaps we'll dig into that another day. Another theory that floats about is that the ARC troopers from the Clone Wars days became what the Empire labeled as Death Troopers and Shadow Troopers. We also know that several clones successfully removed their inhibitor chips and had joined with the rebellion and saw service as late as the Battle of Endor. And then there's also the old stuff of legends regarding Compor and Compnor, Commission for Protection of the Republic, from the Thrawn trilogy, which basically was about how the clone troopers were used as a symbol to sort of reflect patriotism, for lack of a better term, amongst the Empire. They were used as symbols of heroic propaganda by the Empire, and this was done through the Commission for the Protection of the Republic, which was a populist organization commonly known as Compor. But it was basically a propaganda machine, which interestingly enough is almost in direct contrast to what the Confederate of Independence systems were kind of using as their means of tearing down the clones as sort of inhumane and, a biological sacrilege, and that sort of angle was how they were using it. The Commission for the Preservation of the New Order, Compnor, built upon the carefully engineered symbols and messages of their predecessor, Compor, to accelerate the vast military expansion as decreed by Emperor Palpatine. This was all a bit muddy. It was all a bit much, and it's also an example of some of the things in Legends that are probably better left in Legends, and in my opinion don't necessarily need to come over to the canon side of things. But even in Legends, by the late years of the Galactic Empire, clone troopers in the Grand Army of the Republic were virtually forgotten, often being called the Lost Generation and seen as almost the stuff of legend themselves. But with all that being said, one thing's for sure, two things for certain: Stormtroopers, clone troopers, First Order troopers is part of the fabric and DNA of Star Wars. It's part of the iconic element of Star Wars. And truthfully, it's what made me fall in love with Star Wars. For the first time when I remember seeing it, I thought it was pretty dumb for the first 20 seconds of that movie until the doors blew open and the stormtroopers came flooding through the corridor, shooting every rebel that stood in their way. And you could also say they bear a resemblance to the old skull mask. So it's got that going for it as well. Hope you guys are staying safe. Hope you guys are staying sane. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.